Hi, welcome to the Open Security Summit in September 2022. And we have a really, really cool panel here, which actually started as a Twitter thread. And it's a great example of the kind of stuff that we really want to do at the summit, which is this sort of intersection of multiple ideas, multiple concepts, multiple threads, and then figure out something in this. We're still doing this virtually. Eventually, we want to do it all in person. But I'm Dinis Cruz. I help with the summit. I'm also involved in a bunch of other projects. Tariq, can we go with you?
Hi, it's my first time here, so thank you for welcoming me. I've worked in technology for about 25 years, originally trained as a scientist, worked in all kinds of sectors from energy generation, 10 years in central government as part of the reform agenda, GDS, modernizing how we do security, changing the kind of culture around developing digital products and services. I'm doing more private work at the moment, particularly around this emerging issue of making automation and AI safe, fair, and ethical with an eye to emerging regulation. But to summarize what I've really learned over the last sort of 10, 15 years, that it's the questions of culture that are more important, and I hope we'll be able to dive into that today. Cool. Thank you.
Aleksandar?
Yeah, it's also my first time here. Thank you for inviting me, Dinis. I'm a tech lead in a science exchange, a Palo Alto company for a outsourced scientific research marketplace, basically. And I'm an AWS serverless hero and wrote a book on serverless applications with Node.js for Manning, a bunch of other stuff, built some solutions using Alexa and healthcare and data. So I'm also very keen on the topic. And there's a lot of irregulations or missing regulations in that area. How do we include voice, data, healthcare all together, and how do we incorporate that with large corporations such as Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and so forth?
Yeah, we need to sync up, man. I'm really into health data these days. So cool. Tudor?
So hi, I'm Tudor Girba. I'm the CEO of Think. At Think, we are focused on something we call moldable development, which is a new way of thinking about programming through which we actually treat every single software engineering problem as a data problem, and we construct custom tools for every one of these problems. So we also construct a technology to show how this works, which is called Glamorous Toolkit. You can find it at gtoolkit.com. And I'm quite interested in this conversation, especially on the subject of the theory of data, especially data standards and data exchange, and the practice of such a standard and exchanges. So I'm very happy to be here.
Good stuff. Right, Tariq, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, which question should we start with? Should we start with this question of the one you just mentioned, Tudor, which is the kind of ideal aspiration that organizations want for managing data, making it available within the organization, this dream of having it fluidly move around the organization to those that need it so they can work with it and combine it, and then the practice actually of getting there and some of the barriers getting there, but also questioning whether that is actually the right target that we want to get to. So before I challenge whether that's the right target, I wonder if there's any experiences we can share around the table around organizations you're working with at the moment or in the past. I'm working at the moment with one of the UK's largest healthcare organizations, and it has a huge amount of data across different areas, from medical surgery to mental health to kind of physical activity and recovery. And as you would expect, it wouldn't surprise you that these things are in silos. Data quality is poor. Nobody has ever thought about architecting the organization so that the data can be found, so that it can be received or used when needed. And these are things that everyone agrees we should do, but it doesn't happen. So I'll add a thought to the table, which is, One of the reasons it doesn't happen in large organizations is that success is measured locally, a local success for a product or service, whether it's a surgery in a hospital, whether it's the provision of exercise and those services, whether it's the success of counseling and well-being services. The success is local, and anything that is addition to that to make it work at an enterprise level is seen as an extra cost that falls between budgets, falls between accountability. And that's a difficult one to get over. And at the moment, that's my challenge. And my proposal to this organization is that it has to create data asset owners, similar to how you have similar accountabilities for information security. They have to be business people in charge of those areas. So it's the head of hospitals, or the head of gyms, or the head of sort of well-being services, not somebody in IT, not somebody in security. And those people have to have additional accountabilities set on them from the executive board, the top of the organization. If that isn't there, all the effort, as we've seen this over the last 20 years, all the effort to make it happen is bottom up. It's from people trying to be helpful. It's from the IT people trying to be helpful. It's from experts or data enthusiasts wanting to make it data available or to curate it. But it's not. There's no sustainable funding for that. There's no incentive to do that, and it falls away. So when people move on or the focus goes elsewhere, it crumbles. Those are my kind of thoughts to get the conversation going. I know you're smiling there, Tudor, so maybe you can respond with some thoughts there.
I think an owner is absolutely, anytime you see a crack, you probably miss a unique perspective that includes that crack. So clearly, right, that is an important step. I'm just saying, I just believe it's not sufficient. So, and I can give you an example recently from our recent work. We work with a large telecom corporation, and they called us. We usually work with two kinds of companies. We work with either with companies that have some major crisis, or companies that seek a competitive advantage. The interesting thing about those that seek that they have a crisis is they don't ask how you're going to solve the problem. They just want the problem solved. So so this is in this category. We have this telecom company asked us to look at their marketing data pipeline. So this is like a data pipeline that leads to generating the emails with offers for a few tens of millions of people. So yeah, not quite spam, but so the interesting thing about this was that they were at it for quite a while, so more than a year, to try to optimize this. So the pipeline was too slow. That means that they were having delays between when they could find something about the customer between them and the moment they could give it to the customer. And there was some, let's say the CIO had an interest, so he has the visibility all the way to that level. So there was an interest, there was an umbrella, there was an owner, let's say, they would have an interest to see this through. And of course, an initiative was started and a project was started, and a significant amount of money later, nothing happened. And that's like an interesting thing. So why didn't it happen? So we looked at it a little bit, and then first thing we asked is, so can you draw us, what are the big pieces in this data pipeline? And so we're not talking here about, like super fine grain attribute level, data lineage or anything, just, coarse grain, what are the steps here? What's involved here? So they drew for us 4 boxes. And 4 boxes, one of which was actually hosted somewhere else, and it was a 4G, was a low-code platform. One of the boxes was a homegrown transformation engine in which people were actually writing these transformations between, the input and the output in Excel, and that was generating, Oracle, and there were a few couple of other scripts in between. So 4 boxes, right? So we started to look and, start to match get this one. So first of all, we had to parse those languages and building unifying models so that we can start reasoning about it. And then we saw that it doesn't really match. Like we couldn't really fit things the left with the right, and somehow. And then we said, like, is it possible that you have another component right here, like in between the first and the third? And then they looked further and they said, oh, we actually do. So they had a third component, and that was actually outsourced to some other company with their own infrastructure and everything. That was just providing the service for them. Now, here's the problem. So this is it clearly had, like it was visible. The problem was visible. The budget was allocated. All the incentives were in place. Everybody wanted to make a good job, right? And yet they didn't. Why? Because they didn't know the system. And the problem with data is that it's very tempting to look at data, the data is in the database, but that's not where the big problem is. The big problem is in the software that gives semantics to that data. And if you don't know what's in that software, you've lost all meaning from your system. And it doesn't matter how much effort you're going to spend, because you have no mental model of that system. So you can put it differently. One way to look at systems is to look at them as something that we instructed the computer to do. But increasingly, that's not really an appropriate model. A much more interesting model that we propose is to look at systems as basically embedding, encoding knowledge about the company. So every time people talk about knowledge management, but they don't talk about the inside of the software system, any such conversation is meaningless today. It might have been meaningful a few decades ago, but today it is absolutely meaningless, because the core knowledge that makes the company work today is actually already embedded in the system. Because if it's not embedded in the system, it's probably not, it's not the thing that is the most important right now. So, so this is why I'm saying the owner is an important thing, but the ability to look into the meaning of data, that's what differentiates, efforts. It doesn't matter how well intended the effort is, but if you do not understand what the systems that manipulate the data do, there's no chance of actually making it work.
Yeah. I'm smiling a lot because I think you said something which I think many of us probably understood in the back of our minds, but you've expressed it really forward, which is that a lot of us will try and do an audit or a discovery. What data do we have? Let's find out. Let's lift the lid. Let's search the networks. But I think what you said really is an important point, that's incomplete, because you have to understand what is being done with the data, either manually or with software and the encoding. So the semantics are expressed, as you say, mostly in the software. I think that's really, really important point.
So I just want to rectify maybe one thing, and maybe Aleksandar can jump into the conversation. So I'm saying that the manual part is actually misleading. It is misleading to believe that it is possible to reason about systems manually. It is not possible. It's very, very alluring. In fact, that's what most developers, for example, do when they reason about their systems. They manually go and read code. It just doesn't work. It doesn't scale. It's the single largest bottleneck we have, and we have to stop thinking about things like that. Everything about our systems is data, and data is to be dealt with tools. The only thing about those tools is that they have to be custom made. The reason we could outcompete basically people that have worked on this system for more than a decade within a month is because we applied completely different principles, that we refuse to reason about systems manually, because that never works. A system has probably billions of details. It's simply impossible to reason about it, and we shouldn't even try. And it turns out it is much more pleasant and way more productive to actually construct custom tools. Very much like how today, for example, most systems, in fact, most enterprise systems are nothing but data transformation tools. It takes some data, ingest it in some form, model it and manipulate it, and then present it to somebody eventually that will make decisions. And the interesting thing about those people that will make decisions about the data is that they never see the data. They only see projections of the data. And it's like it's a fascinating skill to have. And we possess it with software people. We possess that ability of transforming data problem into information problem or in decision-making problems or situations that people actually can reason about. And we can enhance our ability to reason about many more orders of magnitude details than we can manually. So the long answer, but the bottom line is the manual approach to reasoning about the system can never work, not anymore.
Interesting.
Aleksandar, do you want to chip in?
Yeah, I really like both Tariq's and Tudor's perspectives. And at the same time, you were talking about the visibility, about where does the data flow, where should it flow, who should actually have the permission to see it, what are the repercussions on legal obligations and so forth. And you were talking, Tudor, about the owners and how different people from different perspectives. And this is really all of these, and I guess it's ringing in each of our heads, is actually the title of the track on where we're at Open Security Summit, which is Worldly Maps, an amazing communication tool for us, for everyone in the same organization, coming from different perspectives, to see these different points coming into the organization of the data. Where is the data at? What's the, in which evolution phase is the data actually? And actually seeing the different perspectives from different endpoints, from different people inside the same organization. And you are right, Tudor. We can't manually, kind of try to analyze and see all the intricate details and the data specification. But with a worldly map and with different perspectives coming from different people within the same organization, different stakeholders, we can start to have a glimpse, at least an abstract one, not a detailed one, of the data that's coming in. And I'm just going to give a brief. A couple of years ago, I did a small workshop regarding worldly maps in a single organization. They all understood the core of their business, but they all have different views on what are the other features of their business. Like one had, oh, we're doing this. Another had like customer need in their mind. Another had a like infrastructure piece in their mind. Like everybody coming from a different perspective. But at the end, they all saw what each and every one of them did and how did they understand their role and their business.
Yeah, I think one of the concepts that Tudor was talking about, which I completely agree, although you don't need to do it at the level that he's doing to get value, right? Because Tudor is taking this to an extreme, because he basically built a platform to build and to automate stuff, right? And I do have a bit of a personal connection, because I built this thing called the O2 platform with ages ago when I was doing a lot of security reviews, which is I ended up building a platform to make me productive doing security reviews, because I needed to scale what I was doing. But when I look at data, I completely agree that, data, unless you have a way to make it scale, how do you process, how do you analyze it, how do you view it, how you maintain it, especially it has to be, I think most of it in a graph format, you bog down by complexity and by volumes, and you don't even need a lot, right? Like, you see this individual with spreadsheets of 300, 400 columns, or even 1,000, 10,000, 20,000, and they already lost control. They lost control because the effort to manipulate, the effort to connect the dots, the effort to understand where you are, it's so complicated that almost like the overhead in your head to have to maintain those connections doesn't work. Which is why, in a weird way, Tariq, what you're describing is how major accidents occur, which is there's this amazing amount of data, people don't have value from it, and then the only way they can make it work is by having everybody access to everything, right? And that might give you some advantage in the short term, but what you haven't done was addressed the elephant in the room, which is that you need a feedback loop that actually can start quite small, but it's a feedback loop where you are always automating and improving the data models that you have, and you use those data models to be more data models. And when you get these right, you actually go faster the more technology, the more process, the more things you do, instead of what happens in most technology implementations, which is the more you have, the slower you get, because then you bog down by these interconnections. And data, in an interesting way, we got a lot away with a lot of this, because for a while the data that was imported was credit card data or some information there and stuff like that. But we now getting to the point where there's a huge amount of value in data, and we need to start looking at data properly, especially with healthcare, but not just that, right? Like even integrity of data, because we talk about confidentiality, but guess what? Integrity can be even more important than this. So I think we security can add a lot of value to this conversation, because we've been thinking about data security for quite a while. And now almost like the rest of the world is really thinking about it. But also, like some of you guys mentioned, there's other parts of the world that have figured it out. There's a lot of great stuff about data in medical, in science, in all sorts of other industries that we should be leveraging and learning from them.
If I can come back with a thought, just to kind of take some of what everyone said and underline it, and then maybe people can challenge it as an incorrect interpretation. So I think there's a spectrum where, you know, lots of organizations may start with problems accessing data, not knowing where it is, taking weeks to get permission to use it. You know, that's kind of very recognizable position. And then people paint this picture of, you know, easy access, everything is in a common platform. You click the button, then you can use it, and so on and so on. What I'm suggesting actually is that's wrong as well.
Absolutely.
I think it's absolutely possible. You know, counterintuitively, we don't want to go too fast, because the ability for humans to consider whether something is the right thing to do, or even to consider the semantics and the meaning of assets, whether it's data or other things, there's a human rate, so you can't do that too quickly. So I think that the right target shouldn't be this hyper fluid, easy access, click and point and consume, but should be something where it is easy once you've made the approval, but actually the thinking, the governance, even if we don't like the word governance, the ability for the right people to sit in the same room and say, is this the right data? Has it got the right characteristics? Do I have permission to do it? Is it ethically the right thing to do? And do we kind of hold the right people accountable for what happens next? That shouldn't be rushed. So I think there is an optimum which is between those two extremes. I think that's so in some sense there's a rush to go quick. But actually, I think we need to put the brakes on in the right place. I don't know what your thoughts are around that. Is that heretical?
Well, no, look, you need the model that lives and breathes, right? You need a model where an ecosystem where you start, even if it's small, you start to break down, you know, the understanding of where the data, how to access. The governance, in a weird way, these days can become one of the biggest competitive advantage that you have as a business, right? Because the reality is that data, although there, like you said, there's this rush to promote it, there's also immediately attrition that occurs. And either the attrition happens because somebody's, you know, paying attention, go, whoa, we can't share this, or I guarantee you that it will happen the moment a breach or a mini breach or almost a false kind of like, I would say, a close call happens. You know, the reason why these big organizations, banks and others have these massive layers of systems and process, etc., is not because one day a dude woke up and says, I'm going to create this Kafka-esque environment. It's because they had generations of security incidents, generations of near misses, generations of regulation that is there for a reason, right? Like in a way that a lot of regulation exists because it's trying to do something about it. And we get to the point where if we cannot apply technology in an effective way, and I go back to Tudor, which the way he thinks about it, which is everything is code, and you're creating tools to create tools to visualize the data, to manipulate it, and the visualization is just the visualization that you visualize on top of it. All of that, that's what gets you speed, and that's what gets you scale. And the people that succeed at that, sometimes because they invested a lot, or sometimes because they're just going the right path, today they have massive competitive advantage.
I would like to jump in and say Mark has here. So Mark, can you introduce yourself?
Hey, Mark.
Hi. Yeah, sorry I'm late. I got a bit confused. So I've joined late. I've been listening to what you're saying, and I think what you're talking about is utility of data. So there's a if you think of a graph, right, and on the left-hand side, you've got no privacy. Yeah, it's completely open. And on the right-hand side, it's completely private. And then if you look on the access from top to bottom, you've got utility of data. So when the data is most open, utility of data is the biggest. You can do whatever you want with it because you can see it, or you can use whatever algorithms and methodologies you like against it. When you get complete privacy of the data, you have no utility because you can't use the data. And what you'll find is there's a nice curved graph, yeah, of utility against privacy, and you have to decide an organization where you want to sit on that graph. Yeah, and if you look at the U.S. Census Bureau, they did some work around the census, yeah, and they use a technique called differential privacy. So that allows them to add a bit of noise to the kind of data, so it stops individuals being identified, yeah. And I can't remember the name of the guy, but the head of the Census Bureau, or the technology guy from the previous census, they said you could identify 60% of individuals from the US Census data, the previous one, by just cross-referencing it with other data. But if you use differential privacy, you can. Well, that comes down to the utility of data. So you as an organization have to make that decision of how much kind of privacy do you want for your data and what utility do you need. And the less privacy you have, the more utility. The more privacy you have, the less utility. Yeah.
But how many companies do you think get that balance right? In fact, more importantly, how many companies are in a position where they can even make a rational decision about that?
Yeah, not many probably, because I think obviously data has been around for a very, very long time. Yeah, but as long as computing, but people actually seeing data as a thing and as an asset, and that is probably more recent, and they don't have the skills, the technology to actually use data. I know there's lots of tools out there, but they're not all that great, and there's no one utility or tool or thing that will allow access to all your data for all your use cases. Yeah, there isn't one platform, there isn't one tool. And when I think of data, you have to think about along with the algorithms and the methodologies for data as well. So data's great, if you've got great utility of data, what algorithms are you using to apply to that data, and what methodology are you using? So the algorithms are code, and the methodology is how did you collect that data? Do you know what the bias is in it? How are you making sure you've got a continuous pipeline of data if it changes? How do you organize how do you update your algorithms if the data changes? And how do you get the best utility out of that data?
Yeah,
and I think all that is kind of for a lot of organizations, it's kind of new practices, and then they're not there yet, and they haven't done it before. So and they're sold this kind of these golden bullets of special tools and platforms, and they're not the people and the skills aren't there, and they're not ready yet.
This is a question that I'm actually having to deal with the organization I'm helping at the moment, and it's cast in a slightly different way. It follows on from what you've described, Mark, about this curve and where an organization should sit or wants to sit, but actually should sit is influenced to a major degree by the capabilities and skills and competencies of the people in their organization. So if your general level of data confidence and skill around the organization is low, if you set your target to be fairly liberal in terms of access to data, you're going to have a disaster. Whereas if everyone's very, very highly skilled and you set it to be too cautious, everyone's frustrated. It's like the data scientists who are frustrated because they want to use data, can't get it. But so the question that it might feel a little boring for an audience that's technology focused, but this question of how do you upskill people, that's really difficult, because you can't say do this course online for 2 hours. That's not the answer. You can't say go and get a master's degree in data science. That's not the answer. The answer is not even get an ISO certificate or a CCISP or whatever it is, because that's a different parallel discipline. How do you move an organization which is sized of thousands of people doing either very senior roles or very hands-on roles, and shift them along that spectrum so that more and more of them can be trusted and they can trust themselves with a more liberal approach to accessing or working with data? I'd love your thoughts on that here around the table.
So I have a little input that so on this subject of upskilling, what we have seen, and I think this is also we have seen this one in data science. We've also seen it, for example, in DevOps. People don't necessarily look at it as like a similar domain, but I think it is, because what DevOps does is says, well, you used to deploy your system 1 time per year. Now you're going to deploy it 10 times per day. So the thing is, first of all, you can't do that with the same skills. You need different kinds of skills. So, and that's what captures the immediate attention. So how do I technically deploy that thing 10 times per day? Which is also like, how do I, if I have a question about data, how do I get that information out of the data? It's very similar in terms of like what gets the attention, right? And then there, for that one, you do need the master. You do need to go and do the training for the data science, in data science. But then there's the other part, because the extraction of value, once you have this skill around, it still doesn't lead to anything. So for example, if you have your company and you're now deploying 10 times per day, and you used to deploy it 1 time per year, but you're still asking only one question per year, you're not going to extract any value out of that ability. It's going to be marginal. Maybe it's going to be a little better, but not really better. I mean, not significantly better. However, if you're going to ask 10 questions every single day, then all of a sudden you're going to be in a completely different place. But to be able to ask those 10 questions every single day, you need to learn how to ask the question. And for that one, it turns out it's probably not enough to take a course. It's something that you grow over time. It's like a muscle. It's like learning to speak a foreign language, and the same thing applies to data, right? So it's not enough. Yes, the technology part is important, but that's just the enabler. The real difficulty is training what we call the stakeholder role, the one that asks the question. So if you want to upskill people, you have to focus on tracking how many questions are being asked per day. And then you have to look into the quality of those questions. And then, of course, certain characteristics, because it doesn't, like, for example, kids, they ask questions, but they can't distinguish between whether or not one is valuable and the other one is not. It's going to be the same in an organization. Like at first, all questions, people will ask them at different levels of abstraction. But in time, just like with kids, people will start to differentiate. And especially if you build a culture about differentiating the questions, right? Not the answers. The answers are important because you need the feedback loop and so on, but that's not the most important part. The most important part and the thing that will differentiate are the questions. And this gets us to, what's something that Aleksandar said. So he mentioned, wording maps. And I think that's an important piece. Like, for example, but wording maps, I think they are great tools for generating hypotheses, questions, things to validate in practice. And those are exercises that you can start with minimum training, basically. And then, of course, like with anything that is of meaning, the abilities grow in time. So no course will make you better at this, but doing it 15 times or 15 minutes every single day, like brushing your teeth, will get you much better in a couple of years. So that's what I think we should be looking at. However, like it's also like, for example, in the case of wording maps, it is not enough to just talk in general. It's kind of important to talk about the reality, and the reality comes from your systems, the systems that you already have, and they already embed your knowledge, right? So this is why those two pieces of the technology of extracting and reasoning about the system, it's feeding into this ability to then afterwards map it and see what is worth evaluating afterwards.
That's really, really valuable insight. And what it points to is that you can't do this at scale. You have to start with small efforts, exemplar projects where you start to seed this behavior change. As you say, start using the muscle and get some people doing it and then grow from there. That's a really, really useful insight. think a few more people popped up on the visuals. Did anyone else want to add to the conversation?
Yeah, I would say I mean, you mentioned DevOps there, but there are emerging practices around ML ops, for machine learning, and data ops for data. And there's a great community, actually. The ML ops community is very good. But again, these are emerging practices and people are kind of developing them in the same way, DevOps was developed a long time ago now. And, when you talk about ML ops, you talk about, your data pipelines, training the models, automatically training the models when the data changes. So, there are people working on these kind of and defining these practices around, data in the same way, as code, for DevOps. And I think, but the difference with ML ops is you've got a continuous pipeline of different data, but then you've also got your code and your algorithms and your machine learning models that need to be retrained, and kept up to date and kept up to sync. So it's a bit more of a complex problem, but there are people looking at it and working on it now. So it's not, it's coming, and and if you're on that kind of leading edge, you can join those kind of communities and get involved in. There are tools and techniques being developed now, so you can answer multiple questions a day. Yeah, but not many people can. Yeah.
And the questions, I'm guessing, they also change, right, Tudor? They change corresponding to the, let's say, evolution or standardization, or however we want to frame it, depending on the system that we're trying to upskill, or the people we're trying to upskill at the same time as well.
Yeah. So here's what we find in practice. So at first, people are going to ask generic questions. For example, why is my offer not as accurate? But the problem with these questions is that if I take this question and I apply it in two different contexts that do not have much to do with one another, and they still make sense, they don't have value. Because the value of every system lies in context. So software has this really interesting ability of being highly contextual. And as a consequence, like the problem is, right, every systems, right, we can use pretty much the same technologies over and over, but every system is different and it has value. So the thing is that as long as questions make sense in other contexts, they are not really valuable. But that's the first thing to look at. What are these characteristics? So how do you judge whether a question is good or bad? Is that you just take it and try to apply it in some other system, some other context that maybe or you can imagine. And if it still makes sense, then probably we need to look further. So that's like a very first rule of thumb. And then of course, then the other one afterwards, right? Not every question you're going to ask will lead to value, because that's the other thing. You can ask many questions about, if I take my house and I ask, so is my, what paint did I use? What wood was it used in the door? Yeah, it's a valid question, right? It's kind of generic though, but it will not lead to any, it will not lead to any value.
It may lead to value. It may lead to other questions, and you tend to stop by then kind of drill down into the detail. Yeah.
But that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that some questions are going to be easy to formulate, not necessarily valuable. So the first thing you look at is, does it make sense in another context? Can I go in another home and ask the same question? And if it does, then, well, it's not really valuable. But then the other one is, how do I link it to some narrative that is, for example, being told at the business level or technical level sometimes, and then maybe try to link it to a value stream. So
I wonder if I can introduce a different question which emerged on the Twitter thread. So I think one of the good things about groups like this is you can put something on the table which some of us think is so obvious and settled and uncontroversial, but someone else will say, actually, it's not. So the point I'm putting on the table is data standardization. Clearly, it's an easy and good thing to do. We should all be doing it. But actually, I suspect people around the table will say, actually, there's some gotchas, or So I wonder if I can put something as innocuous as data standards on the table, and people will attack it in a productive way.
Well,
Any thoughts?
It depends on where it is in its evolution.
Yep.
Like a standard, but they could, yeah, it could be an emerging one. They could be competing ones, and it could be, well known, well understood. Yeah. So you'll all give a different answer depending where you think that data standard is in its evolution.
Okay.
But also the security of the data, right? Like when you talk about data, one of the best scalable models is to try to make the data, well, anonymize or pseudo-anonymize or remove value from the data, so that the people downstream, in a way, you can reduce some of the needs to protect it, right? Because it's actually, in a non-dangerous way. Of course, that you have to be careful, like the example of the sensors.
Yeah,
But in organizations, like the data, the value of the data gets propagated far too wide. And if you can have, I like the idea of having standards, having ways to map it. But the only way to really scale this is to create customizations, right? Like, because data will be different, data will be, needs to be manipulated, etc.
You can still have high utility of data and protect privacy.
Yes.
You can use, anonymization techniques, but now there's new privacy enhancing techniques that allow you, encrypt data and still do calculations on that data.
Yep.
There's a recent paper from the ICO in the UK that talks about privacy enhancing techniques and which ones are good, bad, where they are in their kind of evolution to somewhat, and make some kind of recommendation. But the overall arching kind of answer from the ICO is you can use PETs, privacy enhancing techniques, to protect the privacy of individuals and still get utility from that data.
Yep. But the data, is going back actually the point we were just making just a second ago, which is any solution, if you cannot start small in scale, it's a fool's errand, right? I always find that if you need a lot of data, if you load big systems for you to actually start working, it's already a sign that it's probably never going to work, right? But there's a lot of people making probably a lot of money and a lot of things that people can get on the way. I feel like, look, and like data transformation you were talking about, Tariq, like it's almost like if you don't have a way to easily manipulate data at multiple layers, you never scale, because little curveballs will blow up everything, and data is not going to have good quality, little things. So it's almost like you need these multiple layers, again, like Tudor's systems, where you start to process the data, you manipulate, you clean it up, you join, and you do it. And that becomes the system, which actually means that the system auto-corrects itself or is designed to be updated as things change. So instead of creating a system that you try to lock it down, even if that was possible, again, it's fool's errands, right? You might as well have a system that can easily change, and you make that part of your data system. And then you have a case where by the time, it's a bit like, that by the time you create the first dashboard, that's not when you finish. That's when the people that you give you the design for the first dashboard can actually look at the data and going, oh, what I really need is this, right? If at that moment in time, you cannot go back almost to the beginning and start making the tweaks that allows you to propagate the data to that final dashboard, you're now in an unusable situation, right?
Yeah. So you're suggesting that actually we should be building these architectures intentionally as a collection of loosely coupled steps and processes and tools, rather than a great big monolithic solution, because we know that we will have to refine it, and so we build for changeability is what you're suggesting.
That's how nature works, right? One of the biggest hyper complex information management, data management systems in the universe, whatever, in our world, right? But nature, if you look at how it's designed, how an animal, whatever, a living cell is designed, is about that, right?
But isn't that a bit, just a question, isn't that actually also context specific, meaning that some of the data we already know how we're supposed to store? So let's talk about, I don't know, public citizen IDs or something, which we know what's the format, which we know what's the standard for those. So actually then for that system, we don't need to learn, we don't need to provide users, because we already know that their needs have become a commodity, meaning that their expectation is already in the commodity phase.
Yep.
Isn't that like, shouldn't that be only applicable to this kind of custom built or product phase, where we're still kind of learning how does this data, or we are still not completely aware of the user's needs. I mean, to me, this kind of sounds like there's like, this different, I mean, prove me if I'm wrong, like all like this data management system also is context specific on the really, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about this.
Yeah, so I would go back to utility of data again. And years and years ago, when you had data in a system, there was only one utility for it to serve that application. I know an email address was for sending email. It wasn't for authenticating to other systems, for example. And then we move into that data has multiple utilities. Yeah. So an email address is not just for email now, it's for authentication, identification. It has different utilities now. And then you need to think about the future of those unknown cases of utility of that data. What else might you use an email address for? Or even, let people innovate and use that data for other purposes that you haven't even thought about yet. So by looking at the utility of data, and so first of all, it's for one use, an email address or whatever. Then an email address has changed, so it's more than just email, it's identification across systems, etc. And there may be other uses in the future that we haven't thought about. And it's like thinking of your data in that utility terms. That this why we're not very good at data on the multiple uses and unknown uses, because we haven't done that before. We're not used to it. But we are good. We probably say people are good at data within their own systems. Yeah, they kind of understand it and the schemas and all that. But when you look at other forms of utility of that data, we aren't, because we never really thought about it. So we don't have the algorithms and we don't have the methodologies in place. So we need to develop those methodologies, which is what we're talking about, of repeatable pipelines, and we need those kind of DevOps skills to keep those algorithms up to date. When the data changes or the need or the ask question or utility changes.
But I think Aleksandar really hit it right, because this is all context specific. And actually the worldly maps is a great way to think about it, because the data maturity is on the commoditization layer. Then the way you integrate in fact, the way the data will change is very different, right? Our national ID number, that's not going to change, right? That number is already very, very specific versus others. Now,
yeah, but utility of that data could change.
Oh, no, yeah, but that's a custom build on top of it.
For an ID, yeah, but you may use it for something else in the future.
Yeah, but that's on top. So in a weird way, that's actually a good example of worldly maps, where you have this commodity of something and then you connect the dots, right? And now because it's so solid, you can actually think about using it for something else, right? Now, I have a little bit of bad news, because this is a really cool panel, but we made a little mistake and we actually clocked the next one on top of this one. So I do think that we're going to have to do a version 2 of this one at the next summit, because this has been a really, really cool panel. So any final quick thoughts from you guys? But I thought this was a really good discussion that we've been having here.
Thanks for welcoming me to the group. I think what I found really valuable is that it challenges things you thought were always true. I think that's always a good thing for us to get together and shake the assumptions. I think that's really helpful. And there's lots of expertise and experience around the room, and that can collectively, that's really valuable. So thank you for organizing it. That's fantastic.
Cool.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Cool. Let's do a couple more. And there's other sessions on the summit if you join in. And look, the summit is literally about this. It's about intersection of these things and people finding topics, and then they get together. And then the best summit sessions are always the ones that happen like this. So let's create more for even for this, if you want to, for the next ones. Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Cheers.